That'll be your kind of intro, and we will proceed with more specific content after that next week. Just wanted to mostly talk about what I'm calling the four main models of rhetoric. Just a quickie sort of overview of rhetoric as such before we get into that. So this is tough, right? So we are dealing with a subject that has been written about, talked about, and practiced for a very, very long time. One of the oldest, next to poetry and philosophy. Some of the oldest writings that we have in the academy are on rhetoric. So it's very hard to say, like, definitively this is what it is. It's been approached many different ways, thought about many different ways. But for the purposes of, at least the first 2/3 of this class, we want to be grounding ourselves in the ideas about rhetoric in their original state, which is 5th century BC. In Greece, we have emerging a new form of social relationality, new social structures, new political structures, courts, assemblies. This is the emergence of Western democracy. Not perfect democracy, not direct democracy, is a pretty exclusive and elitist arrangement, as we will see when we get into Arendt next week. But this is the first time that in the West we have a formal system, a formal democratic system in place, and a judicial system as well. And what we have are free citizens. Again, not everyone was free, but to the extent that you were a member of one of these Greek city-states, one of these polises, and you were, contributing member of the social order and, employed and ownership and so on, then you were a free citizen. And this new social practice emerged where if you were accused of some malfeasance, some kind of infraction or whatever, then you would have to defend yourself in front of a jury of your peers, strangers, or some strangers at least, right? So the whole point is that we have a new kind of social behavior, a new social practice of individuals pleading with audiences, making their cases to defend themselves or to accuse or whatever. So it was the first time that things like reason, argumentation, logic, and this business of persuasion was thought about in a kind of serious and systematic way. And to the extent that it was like written down and codified, it became what is now known as rhetorical theory, right? So we want to distinguish between the practice of rhetoric, of attempting to persuade, attempting to influence, using language, using words, using symbols, and so on. These are rhetorical practices, right? Real kind of out in the wild, us doing our business of trying to kind of gather people and move people and persuade and dissuade and so on. That's rhetorical practice. And to the extent that we engage in that, we are rhetors, right? But then there's also the thinking about that activity, which we would call rhetorical theory. And so we can go into textbooks and theory books and read what people have said about the practice. But the practice is first, right? And so we have the emergence for the first time of formal systems of, free judiciary and free political assemblies where free citizens come together and attempt to influence and persuade one another. And so you have these scholars sort of off to the side. Some of them were both practitioners and scholars, but a lot of them were just sort of observers and watchers. And they start writing this down and creating manuals and teaching this new art of rhetoric, and talking about concepts and principles and do's and don'ts. And that's rhetorical theory. And that's primarily what we're interested in, but we're also wanting to just remember that it is an illumination of practices that were happening, that, seeing tendencies and patterns and so on, describing it, but also trying to kind of evaluate and judge it at the same time. All right, so all that being said, there's a couple kind of broad things about rhetoric that we want to keep in mind. First of all, that it is a practice. I would emphasize that, that's the way we want to be thinking about it first and foremost, is there something that we do, socially speaking, when we are engaging with other kind of free, I keep doing this free thing. We're free kind of in a sense that we can disagree, we can change our minds, we can ignore people, we can refute them, we can challenge them, right? We have the ability to not agree. To the extent that we are not free, this is Burke who says this, to the extent that we are free, rhetoric becomes necessary. But if we're not free, rhetoric's pointless because we're not free to disagree, we're not free to think differently. All right, so we're dealing with the attempts to move people, move audiences, move minds, move sentiments, move ideas, right? Through words, through our appeals and so on. But we require that other side of the equation to have the ability to not do as we are saying and pleading, and kind of necessary to the whole enterprise, right? So it's a social practice. It's rooted in freedom, and that freedom is sort of structurally guaranteed. Not perfectly, right? But this idea of free citizens coming together to engage in disputes and to attempt to influence and to respond, and this kind of this space of deliberation and contest and conflict, that's what we're talking about here. So the other thing to note then is that rhetoric is instrumental. It's very important to keep in mind that we're not talking about sort of rhetoric theoretically just for the sake of talking about rhetoric theoretically. We're talking about something that we wield socially to accomplish things, right? So rhetoric is instrumental, it's pragmatic, it exists to do things, right? To change minds, to change sensibilities, to shift values, to influence behavior and action, to create new things, to get rid of old things, right? It's always kind of goal-oriented. And sometimes those goals might not even be like fully present or conscious to the speaker, the rhetor. We'll get into that kind of stuff much later, but for the purposes of sort of thinking about rhetoric in its original context, it's purposeful. It wants to do something. All right, so social practice, rooted in freedoms, and instrumental. These are key elements of what rhetoric is. So I'll skip the stuff on, professional justifications for why we study rhetoric and so on. On the second page of these notes here, I get into some of the terms we've already mentioned: rhetorical theory versus rhetorical practice. To the extent that we are engaging in rhetorical practice, we are rhetor. To the extent that we are studying the practices of rhetors, we are rhetoricians, right? So when I'm standing in front of my classes and I'm, attempting to try to illuminate this information and connect with students and that whole bit, that's being a rhetor, because I'm, anyone standing in front of an audience trying to accomplish something, you're being a rhetor. When we kind of stand away and we observe other people's rhetorical practices and study and analyze and kind of pick it apart, then we're rhetoricians. So in most of my daily life, when I'm writing about rhetoric, I'm a rhetorician, rhetorical critic, analyst, and so on. Just some terms that you want to kind of get straight. The next kind of key thing before we get into the models is this business of the canon, in terms of introductory pieces that you want to make sure that you're pretty good on. If you've taken a class before in rhetoric, if it's 216 or 408 or 400, I'm not sure what you might have taken, hopefully something. You've probably talked about the canon. It's the 5 parts of the art of rhetoric. And you've probably heard of these, even if you didn't know that it was the canon: invention, arrangement, style, delivery, memory. And the idea here is that anytime we are engaging in rhetorical practice, we are embodying, we are enacting, we are exercising these 5 parts of the art of rhetoric. So invention is this business of coming up with what to say, to discovering how best to achieve my my hope, right, through this rhetorical effort. It was Aristotle, as we'll get into. He said that rhetoric is the business of, he called it the capacity or the ability to see in a given case the available means of persuasion. And this business of seeing what's available in a given case is really the business of invention, right? What's available to me as I'm trying to accomplish this goal or achieve this outcome? What can I do? How can I get there? What do I need to know? What do I need to have at my disposal? Whether it's facts or stories, or if I'm playing on values, or I'm playing on emotions, right? Or if I'm invoking authorities, or I don't know, using music or ambient kind of effects or whatever, right? Whatever you're trying to do, pyrotechnics, to enhance your impact on the audience, that's invention. And I would argue that it's probably one of the most, if not the most central aspects of all of rhetorical theory is this business of invention, which is how it is that we come up with our ideas, our proofs, our appeals. It's a process of trying to figure out how best to achieve your goal. So the next one is arrangement. That's about the kind of the ordering and the kind of placing of your ideas and how the message is shaped from the intro to the conclusion, from the beginning to the end, all the kind of ups and downs and tempo and just basically I think of it as kind of the shape of your message. That's arrangement. Style and delivery are closely connected, but they're obviously not the same. Delivery has to do with the mechanics, physical kind of mechanics of your speech, your projecting of your voice, eye contact. Do you make hand gestures? How do you stand? How do you hold yourself? Do you speak quickly, slowly? That's all delivery stuff. And style has to do with, I think of it like the sort of the color palette of your speech, right? So you can talk about a speech as being formal or informal, as being, excuse me, as being more playful or more serious and somber, right? And so you can talk about style in terms of word choices and tone and tempo and the kind of the general quality of the performance. And then finally, memory has to do not with just like, is this speech memorized or are you able to kind of just remember something, but it's more about like recall and knowledge and even like wisdom, right? So it has to do with more about your knowledge on a topic and your ability to recall ideas in a moment. So in that sense, it's connected to invention, and it helps your inventional process. The more wisdom and knowledge you have on a topic, the more power you have in terms of creating your appeals. 13. Okay, I got to speed up here. So the four main models of rhetoric are a way of framing the vast amount of information that constitutes the rhetorical tradition. We're talking about Europe, we're talking about North America, we're talking about vast parts of the Western world, writing, Germany, Poland. I mean, everyone's writing about it, doing it, thinking about it over the course of 2,500 plus years, right? So this is meant to kind of just give some shape to this mountain of information. And we approach this through the four kind of main figures that these models are kind of represented by. So we got Gorgias, Plato, Aristotle, and Isocrates / Cicero. The thing there is Cicero's the most popular and most kind of dominant figure in the rhetorical tradition, more so than anyone, even Aristotle. But his particular kind of rhetoric was etched out prior by Isocrates in the Greek contexts, right? So we'll talk about Isocrates, and then we'll think about Cicero as occupying that legacy. So we think about the models, we're thinking about traditions, we're thinking about specific kinds of rhetorical like legacies or specific ways of thinking about rhetoric. We can think about it in sort of four ways. I get this from Tom Conley, who I studied with back in Illinois when I was getting my PhD. He came up with the idea of the four kind of dominant traditions, or what the four models. I've just kind of fleshed these out a little bit. And I'm just going to kind of talk about them in broad, brief terms because we'll be revisiting this stuff plenty. All right, so the Gorgianic model is also known as the sophistic model, but there was many sophists, and Gorgias was probably the most well-known, the most sort of visible and influential. So he's the kind of the standout sophist that we're going to talk about here. And his whole approach is just the sheer instrumental power of language, and specifically of eloquence. Eloquence is this idea of sort of style and delivery. It sort of describes the overall power and effect of a message. So for Gorgias, and we'll see this in the encomium of Helen, he's talking about rhetoric. He even says in his encomium, he says that rhetoric is to the soul what drugs are to the body. Okay, so the point of this model is that it's the sheer instrumental power of language, of discourse, of words, speech, eloquence, to create whatever kind of an effect on the audience that is desired. So if you've heard of rhetoric before taking a class in rhetoric, you've probably most associated with this one model, which is rhetoric is just deception, it's manipulation, it's immoral, and it's all about kind of lies and deceit, and all it wants to do is BS audiences to achieve certain goals, right? Well, that's not the entirety of rhetoric, but that certainly is one kind of tradition. And that kind of falls down to this Gorgianic tradition. And it's important to note that he's mostly talking about rhetoric just in its pure kind of potential to accomplish things, right? We can all draw on examples of the power of language to change minds, to change behaviors, to whip people up, to get them excited about something that, maybe they shouldn't be excited about, or to hate something that they shouldn't hate, or whatever. But we can recall ideas and examples of just language's power to kind of like overtake an audience, right? To kind of arrest their will. That's what we're talking about in the Gorgianic model. So that's what's meant by unilateral and asymmetric. It's coming unilaterally from speaker to audience. The audience is sort of passive. There's an asymmetry between speaker and audience. So the goal is to manipulate and control, or to at least achieve whatever goal by whatever means, okay, through language. So this business of contingencies just means that there's no kind of moral center. There's no single line that the Gorgianic model follows. So a Gorgianic speaker could be for gun control in today's speech, but could be against gun control in tomorrow's speech, as long as it senses that the audience is more favorably disposed to one approach versus another approach. It doesn't care. It's contingent. It deals with, basically whatever. It'll say and do whatever is sort of required to achieve the goal. So that's the real powerful kind of way of thinking about rhetoric, as just sort of pure instrumentality to achieve any kind of end. We can contrast that. It's similar, but it's also quite different to the Platonic model. If you've done any work on Plato in previous classes, you might know a little bit about Plato in the sense that he was this sort of absolutist moral philosopher of abstractions and these immaterial ideas. We'll get into more of that, but the point is he's very different from the sophists in the sense that, or Gorgias at least, in the sense that Plato believed in this sort of oneness of all truth, right? This idea of this kind of celestial realm that immaterial, doesn't exist in any physical sense, pre-exists all of earthly, worldly, physical reality, and it is this realm where pure, almost like God's kitchen or something like this, where like all truth resides. And everything sort of worldly is just an approximation. It's always imperfect and so on. But our goal is always to get closer to those ideas of truth. All right, so he couldn't stand the sophists because they just were trading in contingencies, right? Saying and doing whatever it takes to achieve certain desired results, but without any real regard to what's true and right and good. So that drove him crazy. So when you think about the Platonic model, you can think about it as a sermonic in the sense that Plato's kind of privilege preferred rhetor is like a preacher, right? So when we think about the rhetorical transaction, it's sort of like a sermon. The goal here is to elevate the audience. Whereas with the Gorgianic model, the goal is to sort of like, go through the audience to achieve certain results. The audience is sort of just this object that you're using to kind of get what you want. With the Platonic model, the audience is something that you're trying to elevate, improve, and to lift up, right? And so the idea is that your appeals are coming from some higher source of truth, and you are just this vessel to try to elevate all of us, right? And so it's about abstractions. It's about these sort of weird ideas about perfection and certainty and so on. But the goal is awakening. The goal is very different from the Gorgianic goal. The Gorgianic goal is just results. The Platonic goal is like enlightenment, right? It's elevation. It's awakening. Whenever I think of Plato, I go up. I think of verticality, right? He's very much about, those who have the knowledge should be the speakers. The reason that he didn't care for democracy, and he didn't, is because it's the ignorant leading the ignorant, right? And so he discovered or concluded that rhetoric, all it does is just create appearances in the minds of the ignorant, the masses. They're easily led in different directions. And so it's easy to create belief and conviction in the ignorant masses and lead them into these dark, paths astray from the true path, right? And so he didn't have anything really nice to say about rhetoric or democracy or the people, right? Because he was all about true knowledge and about educating and elevating. Now, the most important of the four models is Aristotle, the Aristotelian model, in terms of not just like the Plato sophist thing is sort of like, well, we have this extreme over here and then we've got this extreme over here. Aristotle kind of is like Goldilocks right in the middle. This is how, this is just him kind of describing how the business of persuasion actually operates. And so what he gives us in his rhetoric is just this kind of diagnostic layout of the mechanism of persuasion. He was very invested in reasons, in argumentation, in a kind of informal sense. So how is it that we reason argumentatively in non-formal, non-kind of specialized settings, right? So whether it's in front of a jury or assembly or a funeral or whatever, how do we kind of just informally go about the business of creating these appeals and connecting with audiences in a way that leads to better outcomes, right? And so this is the first model that is not unilateral. Both Plato and the Gorgianic model are unilateral. It's something that's coming from and through the speaker to and at the audience. Whereas with Aristotle, it's a collateral relationship, meaning that I can't persuade you unless I know something about you. You and your knowledge and your beliefs and your personality and all the stuff that make you you is the kind of the raw material of my ability to persuade you. I can't just manipulate you. I've got to appeal to you. I've got to appeal to your values. I've got to appeal to your sense of what is true and right and wrong and how things work and so on. It's my job, my inventional job. This is the discovering the available means of persuasion in a given case. It's my job to figure out what my audience is composed of and work with that. So that's collateral. I can't persuade you without knowing about you, all right? So as we'll see when we get into Aristotle, he's very much about observation, about analyzing situations, analyzing audiences, analyzing your topic, knowing as much as possible in that memory canon, knowing as much as possible about a given situation as you can, which enhances your ability to potentially persuade and influence your audience. So I think of, if the Gorgianic model dealt with contingencies and the Platonic model deals with certainties, Aristotle deals with probabilities, right? So the things that can be kind of more or less relied upon. And he says basically this is the business of, rhetorical engagement, is that we're always trying to appeal and rely on what we know about each other and about situations for the most part. It's not perfect knowledge, but it's reliable knowledge, okay? So that's probabilities. So the goal here is to achieve the best possible case. Not necessarily to win over any given specific audience, but to make the best possible argument in a kind of hypothetical sense as one could make given all the circumstances of the situation. So Aristotle is really the most important in terms of the concepts that he talks about, in terms of how we go about the business of actually dealing with audiences, trying to kind of work with them, work with ideas. He's key. We'll get back to him. The final example is closely related to Aristotle, but if Aristotle is more of the I think of him as like a kind of a technician in a lab studying rhetoric, like putting putting actual acts of persuasion under a microscope and seeing, oh, there's an enthymeme, oh, there's a logos and ethos and pathos. And he's very kind of observational and diagnostic and analytic, whereas the goal in Cicero is more about like actual practice, right? And so the Isocratean / Ciceronian model is like the debater, the civic debater model, right? This is the statesman model. This is, you know, Cicero was someone who was a lawyer, he was a senator, he was a practitioner, a brilliant speaker. He's speaking from the perspective of experience, of actual, you know, knowing how to make specific cases. So if Aristotle is dealing more with probabilities, Cicero and Isocrates are dealing with more about like particularities, right? The real world here and now, how to work with actual audiences and deal with, you know, drawing on all kinds of personal experience. The selection that we'll look at, De Inventione, is really just all about how to make kind of legal arguments. And what about, and if this were to be the case, then you go this direction. And if this were to be the case, then you go to this direction. It's very intricate in terms of like all those kind of particularities. But it's quite similar. It's very much about the audience. It's very much about the kind of the norms, the ethical norms of debate and exchange. So this is sort of like the everything comes together in one great perfect model is Cicero. Collateral, reciprocal, right? Cicero placed a heavy emphasis on the power and importance of delivery. Aristotle, not so much. He was more interested in the ideas, whereas Cicero was interested in like the actual practice. So he talks a lot about the power and importance of delivery, but also with lots of caution, because delivery can blind audiences if it's powerful enough, right? And so for him, it's like, be careful. Eloquence and wisdom need to go together. You need the delivery and the style and the power of your kind of physicality, but you also need the wisdom. You need the learning. You need the knowledge. You need the true ideas, right? So he's sort of the all of the best parts together in one model, all right? That's quick. I know it's a quickie kind of rundown of the models, but you know, that's just the kind of the broad overview. We're going to be getting into each one of these as we proceed in the next few weeks. But these are, again, the major traditions. It's not to say that anyone who comes after who might be called a Ciceronian is an exact copy of Cicero. It's more about tendencies, right? And so we're more about identifying these kind of four major kind of clusters of tendencies and sort of trying to draw some distinctions between them, even though there's some similarities between Plato and Isocrates, or Plato and Gorgias, and there's some similarities between Aristotle and Cicero. They're unique enough to be talked about in their own terms. So that's kind of how we're going to be thinking about the tradition, is through these four pillars, these four models that we can kind of plot other texts in relation to. All right, let's see. Oh, shoot, 30 minutes. All right. I'm going to work on keeping things tight. 30 minutes is probably the max that I'm going to go at here. I did this in my in-class class today and took a little bit longer. So I'm going to work on keeping these videos fairly close to that 20-minute mark. But there you go. There's the kind of overview intro of rhetoric, the models, and from here we're going to be going into more kind of contextual historical stuff next week with Arendt and the second chapter for Herrick, and then oh yeah, and then we're going to look at Gorgias's Encomium and De Soi Logoi. That's week 2. New videos coming early in the week. Cheers.